The morning dew clung to Thomas Miller's worn boots as he trudged through the muddy field. His weathered hands, calloused from years of working the land, gripped a rusty hoe. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the small farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Once thriving and prosperous, the Miller farm now stood as a testament to hardship and struggle. "Another day," Thomas muttered to himself, surveying the withered crops that stretched before him. The drought had been merciless, ravaging the countryside for months. What little remained of his cornstalks bent awkwardly, leaves curled and yellowing. The beans had fared no better, with entire rows simply giving up the fight against the relentless heat. His wife, Sarah, would be up soon, preparing what meager breakfast they could afford. Their 2 children, Emma and Jacob, were too young to understand why their portions grew smaller with each passing week. Thomas felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his shoulders. A farmer who couldn't feed his family was no farmer at all, or so his father would have said. The distant sound of hooves pulled Thomas from his gloomy thoughts. A rider approached along the dirt road that bordered his property. Strange, he thought. They rarely received visitors, especially this early in the morning. Their nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the town was a half-day's journey on foot. Thomas squinted against the morning sun, trying to make out the approaching figure. It was Nathaniel Cooper, the wealthy landowner whose estate encompassed most of the Eastern Valley. What business would Cooper have here? The men had never been friends, and in recent years, as Thomas's fortunes declined, Cooper had made no secret of his desire to add the Miller farm to his growing collection of properties. "Miller!" Cooper called out, reining in his magnificent stallion at the edge of the field. The animal was a stunning specimen, with a gleaming chestnut coat and powerful muscles that rippled beneath its skin. It was the kind of horse Thomas could only dream of owning, worth more than his entire farm at this point. "Cooper," Thomas acknowledged, walking slowly toward the man. No sense rushing to what was surely bad news. "What brings you to my doorstep at this hour?" Nathaniel Cooper sat tall in his saddle, looking down at Thomas with an expression that mixed disdain with something else. Was it pity? His clothes were immaculate, his boots polished to a shine that seemed to mock the mud they now hovered above. "I've come with a proposition," Cooper said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "One that might interest a man in your situation." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "My situation is my own concern." Cooper laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Is it? The bank tells me otherwise. 3 missed payments, Miller. Word is they're calling in your loan by month's end." The blood drained from Thomas's face. He had hoped to keep that particular piece of information from spreading through the community. Pride was sometimes all a man had left. "What's your proposition?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cooper dismounted with fluid grace, patting his horse's neck. "I'll take this useless plot of dust off your hands, give you enough to settle with the bank and start fresh somewhere else, perhaps in town, where you could find work better suited to your talents." The insult stung, but Thomas forced himself to remain calm. "This land has been in my family for—" Yes, 3 generations. "So you've said many times," Cooper interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Sentiment doesn't feed children, Miller. Or have you forgotten that?" Thomas fell silent, the truth of Cooper's words cutting deeper than any blade could. "I'll give you 3 days to consider my offer," Cooper said, turning back to his horse. "It's more than fair, given the circumstances." As Cooper prepared to mount, his stallion suddenly reared, startled by something in the nearby brush. The animal's powerful hooves sliced through the air as Cooper struggled to maintain control. In his effort to calm the horse, Cooper's foot slipped in the mud, and he fell awkwardly, crying out as his leg twisted beneath him. Thomas rushed forward instinctively, grabbing the horse's reins before it could bolt. The animal calmed under his steady hand. Thomas had always had a way with horses, even as a boy. "My leg," Cooper groaned, clutching his knee. "I think it's broken." Thomas knelt beside the fallen man, examining the injury with gentle hands. "Not broken, but badly sprained. You won't be riding home on that." Then fetch help, man, Cooper demanded, his face contorted with pain. Thomas looked at the magnificent horse, now calm under his touch, then back at Cooper. It'll be faster if I take you myself. My wagon's not much, but it'll get you home. Before Cooper could protest, Thomas helped him to his feet and guided him toward the farmhouse. Sarah appeared at the door, her questioning gaze turning to concern when she saw Cooper limping heavily against her husband's support. Harness the wagon, Thomas told her quietly. Mr. Cooper needs to get home. Within minutes, their old wagon was ready, cushioned with what blankets they could spare. As Thomas helped Cooper onto the seat, the wealthy landowner paused, a curious expression crossing his face. Your horse, Cooper said, gesturing toward the dilapidated barn where Thomas's ancient plow horse was stabled. Will it manage the journey to my estate and back? Thomas sighed. Old Bess was in no condition for such a journey, especially in this heat. The mare was approaching 20 years of age, with arthritic joints that made even the shortest trips painful for her. I'll manage, Thomas said simply. Cooper studied him for a moment, then nodded toward his own stallion, now grazing peacefully nearby. Take mine. He knows the way home and can easily make the journey. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. Your thoroughbred? I couldn't possibly. Don't be foolish, Miller, Cooper snapped, wincing as he adjusted his position on the wagon seat. It's practical, nothing more. The animal needs exercise and I need to get home, unless you'd prefer to leave me here while you walk to my estate for help? Put that way, Thomas had little choice. He approached the magnificent stallion cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones. The horse regarded him with intelligent eyes, allowing Thomas to take the reins without protest. His name is Monarch, Cooper offered, watching Thomas stroke the horse's muzzle. He can be temperamental, but he seems to have taken a liking to you. The journey to Cooper's estate took less than an hour, with Monarch pulling the wagon effortlessly through the countryside. Thomas couldn't help but marvel at the animal's strength and grace. What would it be like to own such a horse? To harness such power for plowing his fields or traveling to market? Cooper's estate came into view, a sprawling mansion surrounded by lush, irrigated fields that showed no signs of the drought afflicting Thomas's land. Servants rushed out to help their master, casting curious glances at Thomas and the wagon. Get Dr. Bennett, Cooper ordered one of the men, and see that Mr. Miller is given refreshment before his journey home. Thomas declined the offer. I should get back. There's work to be done. Cooper studied him for a long moment, then nodded to a nearby servant. Bring me my ledger. When the book was brought, Cooper scribbled something inside, then tore out the page and handed it to Thomas. Your debt at the bank. Consider it settled. Thomas stared at the paper in disbelief. Why would you? Let's call it payment for your assistance today, Cooper interrupted, and for not leaving me to the mercy of those field mice that spooked my horse. Before Thomas could respond, Cooper added, The horse, Monarch. Keep him. What? Thomas nearly dropped the reins in shock. You heard me. The beast clearly prefers your company to mine, and I have others. Consider him part of our arrangement. What arrangement? Cooper's eyes narrowed. You still owe me, Miller. I'll expect to hear your answer about my offer for your land in 3 days' time. The horse doesn't change that. As Thomas drove home with Monarch pulling the wagon, his mind raced with confusion. Cooper's unexpected generosity regarding the debt and the horse seemed completely at odds with his determination to acquire the Miller farm. What game was the man playing? When Thomas arrived home, Sarah stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. Behind her, Emma and Jacob peered curiously at the magnificent horse now standing in their yard. What happened? Sarah asked, taking in the sight of the thoroughbred and the absence of Cooper. Thomas handed her the banknote, watching as her eyes widened in disbelief. Cooper settled our debt, he explained, and he gave us his horse. Gave us his... Sarah trailed off, looking at Monarch with wonder. Why would he do such a thing? Thomas shook his head. I'm not entirely sure, but he still wants an answer about buying our land. Sarah's face fell. Then nothing has really changed. Perhaps, Thomas replied, stroking Monarch's gleaming neck. "But perhaps everything has." That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface. Sarah placed a bowl of thin stew before him, the last of their potatoes, and a scrawny rabbit Thomas had snared the previous day. The children had already eaten and been tucked into bed, their excited whispers about the magnificent horse finally fading into the rhythmic breathing of sleep. "We need to talk about Cooper's offer," Sarah said quietly, sitting across from her husband. Her hands, red and chapped from washing, fidgeted with the frayed edge of her apron. Thomas nodded, pushing the stew around with his spoon. Despite his hunger, he found little appetite tonight. "I know. The debt being settled buys us time, but the drought isn't ending anytime soon." Sarah's practical nature had always been her strength, and one horse, no matter how fine, won't save this farm if the rains don't come. "Monarch isn't just any horse," Thomas argued, a spark lighting his tired eyes. "You should have seen him pull that wagon, Sarah. Twice the load old Bess could manage, and without breaking a sweat. With him, I could plow the north field in half the time." Sarah reached across the table to take his calloused hand in hers. "To what end, Thomas? To plant seeds in dust? To watch more crops wither and die?" Her voice was gentle but firm. "Cooper's offer might be our only chance to start fresh." Thomas pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. "I'm not selling to Cooper. This land is all we have, all my father had, and his father before him." "We have each other," Sarah countered, rising to face him. "We have Emma and Jacob. Would your father want you to cling to this land at the expense of his grandchildren's futures?" The question hung between them, unanswered. Thomas grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "I need to check on the horse." Outside, the night air carried the faint scent of distant rain, a cruel tease that had repeated itself throughout the season without delivering relief. The barn door creaked as Thomas pushed it open, the familiar smell of hay and animal welcoming him. Old Bess nickered softly from her stall, while in the larger enclosure, Monarch's powerful silhouette shifted in the darkness. Thomas lit a small lantern, its glow revealing the thoroughbred in all his glory. The horse's coat gleamed like burnished copper even in the dim light. Monarch turned his intelligent gaze toward Thomas, ears pricked forward in recognition. "What am I going to do, boy?" Thomas murmured, approaching the animal with an apple he'd been saving, one of the few that had survived on their struggling orchard. Monarch accepted the offering delicately, his velvet lips tickling Thomas's palm. As the horse crunched the apple, Thomas ran his hand along the animal's powerful neck. Something didn't feel right. Frowning, he moved his fingers more carefully over the area, feeling a small, hard object embedded beneath the skin. "What's this?" he whispered, bringing the lantern closer. There, partially hidden by Monarch's mane, was what appeared to be a small lump about the size of a pea. Most people would never have noticed it, but Thomas had spent his life tending to animals. He knew the difference between a common insect bite and something unusual. With gentle fingers, he probed the area. Monarch remained still, seemingly unbothered by the examination. The lump felt hard, almost metallic, not a natural growth at all. Thomas's heart began to race. Could this explain Cooper's strange generosity? Was there something wrong with the horse that the wealthy landowner had discovered? Some illness or condition that made the animal less valuable? But Cooper hadn't seemed concerned about Monarch's health. In fact, until the incident with the mice, the stallion had appeared to be in perfect condition. And even after the accident, Cooper had mentioned that the horse preferred Thomas's company, not that the animal was defective in any way. Thomas decided he would need to take a closer look in daylight. For now, he made sure Monarch had fresh water and enough hay for the night, then returned to the house, his mind churning with possibilities. Sarah had already gone to bed by the time he came inside, the remains of his untouched stew cleared away. Thomas sighed, feeling a pang of guilt for walking out on their conversation. She was right about many things: the drought, the uncertain future, the children's needs. but selling to Cooper felt like surrendering something essential about himself, about his heritage and identity. Sleep came fitfully that night, with dreams of racing through open fields on Monarch's back, the wind whipping through his hair, only to suddenly find himself falling, the ground rushing up to meet him as Cooper laughed from a distant hilltop. Thomas rose before dawn, as was his habit. Sarah still slept, her face peaceful in the gray light of early morning. He dressed quietly and slipped outside, eager to examine Monarch's neck more thoroughly. The rooster hadn't yet announced the day when Thomas entered the barn, lantern in hand. Monarch greeted him with a soft nicker, moving to the front of his stall as if expecting another treat. "Good morning to you too," Thomas said, smiling despite his concerns. There was something about the horse's presence that lifted his spirits, a nobility and grace that seemed to fill the dilapidated barn with new energy. Setting the lantern on a nearby shelf, Thomas entered the stall and began to carefully part Monarch's mane where he had felt the strange lump the night before. In the better light, he could see a small area where the hair pattern was slightly disrupted, not enough to notice casually, but clear evidence of some kind of procedure. His fingers found the hard object again, and as he examined it more carefully, he realized it wasn't a growth at all. It felt manufactured, with defined edges beneath the skin. "What did they put in you, boy?" Thomas murmured, mind racing. A sudden noise at the barn entrance made him turn. Emma stood in the doorway, her 8-year-old frame silhouetted against the growing dawn. "Papa, Mama says breakfast is ready," she announced, then added with undisguised excitement, "Can I pet the new horse before we eat, please?" Thomas smiled, beckoning his daughter forward. "Come meet Monarch, sweetheart, but slowly now, no sudden movements." Emma approached with the natural caution of a child raised around farm animals. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the thoroughbred's impressive stature. "He's so big," she whispered, reaching out a small hand. Monarch lowered his head, blowing softly through his nostrils as Emma's fingers made contact with his muzzle. The horse's gentleness with the child only deepened Thomas's puzzlement about the object embedded in the animal's neck. "What were you looking at, Papa?" Emma asked, noticing her father's distracted expression. Thomas hesitated, then decided there was no harm in sharing his discovery. "There's something strange here, in his neck. Feel, but be very gentle." Emma's small fingers explored where Thomas indicated, her brow furrowing in concentration. "It's like a little button under his skin," she observed with a child's simple clarity. "That's right," Thomas agreed. "And I'm trying to figure out why it's there." Emma considered this with all the seriousness an 8-year-old could muster. "Maybe it's magic," she suggested, "like in the stories Mama tells about enchanted animals." Thomas chuckled, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Maybe so, little one. Now let's not keep your mother waiting." As they walked back to the house, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's fanciful suggestion might hold a grain of truth. Not magic, of course, but something unusual. Something that might explain why a man like Nathaniel Cooper would give away such a valuable animal. Breakfast was a simple affair. Cornmeal mush with the last of their preserved blackberries stirred in for sweetness. Jacob, at 5, peppered Thomas with questions about the new horse, while Emma solemnly informed her brother about the magic button in Monarch's neck. Sarah caught Thomas's eye across the table, raising a questioning eyebrow. "There's something embedded under the horse's skin," Thomas explained in a low voice while the children argued about whether Monarch could fly if the button was pressed. "It's not natural. Feels like metal or some other material. Someone put it there deliberately." Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Could it be harmful? To the horse or to us?" Thomas shook his head. "Monarch seems healthy enough. Better than healthy. He's the finest animal I've ever seen." "Then why would Cooper give him away?" Sarah asked, echoing the question that had kept Thomas awake most of the night. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I intend to find out." After breakfast, Thomas made a decision. "I'm riding into town," he announced, gathering his hat and a small pouch containing a few precious coins. We need supplies, and I want to check if the general store has had any mail come through for us. The last part was a pretense. They rarely received mail, but Thomas had another purpose in mind. Doc Williams, the town's veterinarian, might be able to shed some light on the mysterious object in Monarch's neck. "Take the wagon," Sarah suggested. "If you're getting supplies, I'm riding Monarch," Thomas interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. It's time to see what he can really do. The look of apprehension on Sarah's face was clear, but she nodded. "Be careful, Thomas. That's not old Bess you'll be sitting on." Thomas kissed her cheek and ruffled the children's hair before heading back to the barn. His heart raced with anticipation as he saddled Monarch, speaking softly to the stallion all the while. "Let's find out your secrets, boy," he murmured, swinging himself onto the horse's back. Monarch stood perfectly still, accepting Thomas's weight without protest. Then, with just the slightest pressure from Thomas's legs, the thoroughbred moved forward, stepping out of the barn and into the morning sunlight. The journey to town would normally take Thomas over 2 hours on Old Bess. As Monarch broke into an easy trot down the dirt road, Thomas had a feeling they'd be there in half that time. What he would discover there, however, remained to be seen. The sensation of riding Monarch was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. The powerful animal moved with effortless grace, each stride smooth and controlled despite their increasing speed. Thomas found himself grinning like a boy as they thundered down the dirt road, the wind rushing past his face. Old Bess, faithful as she was, had never managed more than a plodding trot in her best years. This was pure exhilaration. The journey to town passed in a blur of dust and sunshine. Fields and farmhouses flew by, and more than one farmer stopped to stare as Thomas and Monarch raced past. The thoroughbred seemed to enjoy the exercise, his ears pricked forward eagerly, responding to the slightest guidance from Thomas's hands and legs as if they had been partners for years rather than mere hours. As they approached the outskirts of Millfield, Thomas slowed Monarch to a walk, conscious of the attention they would draw. The small town served as a hub for the surrounding farms, with a general store, a bank, a church, a small school, and a handful of other businesses clustered around a central square. Doc Williams maintained an office and small animal hospital on the edge of town, where he treated everything from prized bulls to beloved family dogs. Thomas guided Monarch toward the hitching posts outside the general store, aware of the heads turning in their direction. Whispers followed him as he dismounted, securing the thoroughbred to the post with a secure knot. "That Miller, riding Cooper's horse? What business does he have with such an animal? Heard Cooper visited the Miller place yesterday." Thomas ignored the murmurs, patting Monarch's neck reassuringly before entering the store. He needed a few essential supplies: salt, coffee, a bit of sugar if they could afford it, before seeking out Doc Williams. The bell above the door jangled as Thomas stepped inside. The familiar scents of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco greeted him. Behind the counter, Elias Green, the store's proprietor for the past 30 years, looked up from his ledger. "Thomas Miller," Green said, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Quite an entrance you made today. Half the town's talking about that horse you rode in on." Thomas nodded, approaching the counter. "Just need a few things, Elias. Bit of coffee, some salt. And an explanation for how you came by Nathaniel Cooper's prized stallion?" Green added, not unkindly. The older man had known Thomas since he was a boy, had watched him inherit the farm after his father's passing, had seen the struggle of recent years etched into his face. Thomas sighed. No point in keeping it secret. The whole town would know soon enough. "Cooper gave him to me, after he took a fall on my property yesterday." Green's eyebrows climbed even higher. "Gave him to you? Nathaniel Cooper? The same man who's been trying to buy your land for the past 2 years?" "The very same," Thomas confirmed, examining a display of tobacco tins to avoid the shopkeeper's incredulous stare. "Well, I'll be," Green muttered, shaking his head as he began to gather Thomas's modest order. "There's got to be more to that story." Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where he'd stored a small piece of paper with a crude drawing of the object he'd felt in Monarch's neck. There usually is with Cooper. After paying for his supplies, the bill noticeably smaller without the bank debt hanging over his head, Thomas stepped back outside. Monarch stood patiently at the hitching post, drawing admiring glances from passers-by. "I'll be back shortly, boy," Thomas told the horse, giving him another reassuring pat before heading toward Doc Williams's place at the end of the street. The veterinarian's office was a simple wooden building with a small fenced area behind it for recovering animals. A painted sign reading H. Williams, Veterinary Services, hung above the door. Thomas knocked twice before entering. Harold Williams was tending to a farmer's goat when Thomas arrived, his sleeves rolled up as he examined the animal's hoof. In his 60s, with silver hair and spectacles perched on his nose, Doc Williams had been caring for the area's livestock since before Thomas was born. "Be with you in a moment," Williams called without looking up. Thomas waited patiently, watching the practiced movements of the older man's hands as he cleaned a small cut on the goat's foot, applied a salve and wrapped it neatly with a bandage. "There you go, Jenkins," Williams said to the farmer. "Keep it clean and dry for 3 days, then remove the bandage. She'll be right as rain." After Jenkins departed with his goat, Williams turned his attention to Thomas. "Thomas Miller, don't often see you in town these days. What brings you to my door? Nothing wrong with old Bess, I hope?" "Bess is fine, all things considered," Thomas replied. "I'm actually here about another horse, one that recently came into my possession." Williams's eyebrows rose. "Do tell." As briefly as possible, Thomas recounted the events of the previous day, Cooper's fall, the unexpected gift of the horse, and the mysterious object he'd discovered in Monarch's neck. The veterinarian listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly intrigued. When Thomas finished, Williams removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully with a handkerchief. "And you say this object feels like metal? Embedded under the skin?" Thomas nodded, producing the sketch he'd made. "About here, just below the mane. Small, but definitely artificial." Williams studied the drawing, frowning. "I've seen something similar before, though rarely in horses. Typically in research animals, or occasionally in very valuable livestock." "What is it?" "Could be an identification chip, newer technology, mostly used by wealthy breeders or racing stables." Williams replaced his spectacles. Though why Cooper would give away a microchipped thoroughbred remains a mystery. Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. "What exactly does this chip do?" "It stores information, the animal's lineage, medical history, ownership records. Some of the newer ones can even track the animal's location." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Track its location? You mean Cooper could know exactly where Monarch is at all times?" Williams nodded slowly. "Potentially, yes, though he'd need specialized equipment to read the data. Not something your average farmer would have lying around." "But Cooper would," Thomas muttered, pieces starting to fall into place. "Indeed he might," Williams agreed. "The question is, why give you a horse he can track? What's Cooper's game?" Thomas shook his head, bewildered. "I was hoping you might have some insight." The veterinarian stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I'd need to examine the animal to be certain. Is this mysterious steed nearby?" "Hitched outside the general store." Williams grabbed his bag. "Then let's have a look, shall we?" They walked back to the town square, where Monarch continued to draw admiring glances. The thoroughbred's coat gleamed in the midday sun, his powerful muscles rippling beneath as he shifted his weight. "My word," Williams breathed, approaching the animal with professional appreciation. "That's Monarch, all right. Cooper paid a small fortune for him at the Kentucky auctions last year. Prize-winning bloodlines. The man turned down offers twice what he paid within months of bringing him home." Thomas watched as the veterinarian greeted the horse with an experienced hand, speaking softly as he ran his fingers along Monarch's neck. "Here." Thomas indicated the spot where he'd felt the strange object. Williams nodded, probing gently. After a moment, his expression changed. "You're right. There's definitely something there." He reached into his bag, producing a small handheld device Thomas had never seen before. "This is a reader, detects and displays basic information from animal identification chips. New technology, but useful for my practice. Thomas watched, fascinated, as Williams held the device near the spot on Monarch's neck. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the device emitted a soft beep, and Williams' eyes widened behind his spectacles. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "What is it?" Thomas asked, his heart racing. "What does it say?" Williams looked up, his expression a mixture of astonishment and concern. "This isn't just any identification chip, Thomas. It's military grade, the kind they use for special operations. And according to this..." He glanced back at the device. "Monarch here isn't registered to Nathaniel Cooper at all." Thomas frowned, confused. "Then who..." "The chip says this horse is property of the United States government, specifically something called Project Pegasus, and there's a warning label, classified. Unauthorized access to this animal is punishable by federal law." Thomas stared at the magnificent animal, who gazed back at him with those intelligent eyes. "That's impossible. Cooper's had Monarch for over a year. Everyone knows he bought him at auction." "Maybe he did, maybe he didn't," Williams replied, putting the reader away. "But one thing's certain. You've got yourself a very special horse, Thomas, and I have a feeling Cooper giving him to you wasn't an act of generosity." A sudden commotion at the other end of the street drew their attention. 3 black automobiles had entered the town, moving slowly down the main thoroughfare. They weren't military vehicles, but their occupants, men in dark suits with stern expressions, carried themselves with unmistakable authority. "Speak of the devil," Williams murmured. "I think your special horse just attracted some special attention." Thomas moved instinctively to Monarch's side, placing a protective hand on the animal's neck. "What do I do?" Williams glanced between Thomas, the approaching vehicles, and the magnificent horse. "If I were you, son, I'd get back on that horse and ride, fast, and I'd make sure they didn't follow me home." Thomas hesitated only a moment before untying Monarch and swinging himself into the saddle. "Thank you, Doc." The veterinarian nodded grimly. "Be careful, Thomas. Whatever game Cooper's playing, it's bigger than a land dispute now." With a final nod, Thomas turned Monarch toward the edge of town. As the black cars drew closer, he leaned forward and whispered in the horse's ear, "Let's show them what you can really do, boy." And with that, they were off, racing away from Millfield and the mysterious men, dust billowing in their wake. Monarch's powerful legs ate up the ground as they raced away from Millfield. Thomas had never moved so fast in his life. The countryside blurred around him, the wind rushing past with such force that his eyes watered. Behind them, he heard the roar of automobile engines as the black cars gave chase. "Come on, boy," Thomas urged, leaning low over Monarch's neck. "Show me what you can do." The thoroughbred responded as if understanding every word, surging forward with renewed energy. Thomas risked a glance back and was astonished to see the gap between them and the pursuing vehicles widening. Somehow, Monarch was outpacing modern automobiles on open ground. As they approached a fork in the road, Thomas made a split-second decision. Going right would lead toward home, toward Sarah and the children. Going left meant the rocky terrain near Willow Creek, more difficult for cars to navigate. He couldn't lead these men to his family, whoever they were. "Left, Monarch," he murmured, applying the gentlest pressure with his leg. What happened next nearly unseated him. Instead of simply turning left, Monarch gathered himself and leaped, not just over the ditch at the side of the road, but across it and the fence beyond in a single, impossible bound. They landed in the meadow beyond, Monarch never breaking stride as he raced toward the distant tree line. Thomas clung to the saddle, heart hammering in his chest. No horse should have been able to make that jump. It was a good 15 feet across. Yet Monarch had cleared it effortlessly, as if gravity held less sway over him than ordinary horses. At the tree line, Thomas glanced back again. The black cars had stopped at the fork in the road, their occupants now standing beside the vehicles, watching through binoculars. They weren't giving chase across the meadow, perhaps unwilling to risk their automobiles on the uneven ground. Monarch plunged into the woods, navigating between trees with uncanny precision. Thomas had grown up exploring these forests, but even he would have hesitated to ride at such speed through the dense undergrowth. Yet the horse moved with absolute confidence, never faltering, never hesitating, as if he could see paths invisible to human eyes. After several minutes of weaving through the forest, they emerged at the rocky banks of Willow Creek. The stream was shallow but wide, its waters clear and swift-moving over smooth stones. Thomas reined Monarch to a stop, giving the horse a moment to catch his breath while he considered their options. The men in black suits would likely circle around, searching the forest exits and the roads beyond. Going home directly was still too risky. He needed time to think, to understand what was happening. "What are you, really?" Thomas whispered, stroking Monarch's neck. The horse's breathing was remarkably steady for an animal that had just sprinted over a mile at incredible speed. He wasn't even sweating heavily. Monarch turned his head, regarding Thomas with those intelligent eyes. For a moment, Thomas had the unsettling feeling that the horse was assessing him, considering whether to reveal more of his secrets. The sound of distant engines broke the moment. The black cars were on the move again, circling around to the road that crossed Willow Creek half a mile downstream. "We need to keep moving," Thomas decided, patting Monarch's neck. "But where?" As if in response, Monarch stepped forward into the creek, water splashing around his hooves. He looked back at Thomas expectantly. "Upstream?" Thomas questioned. "They'll still be able to track us through the water." Monarch snorted, pawing at the creek bed impatiently. "All right, I trust you," Thomas said, still marveling at how he was now having a conversation with a horse. "Lead on." They moved upstream for about a quarter mile, Monarch picking his way carefully along the rocky creek bed. The water rarely rose above his fetlocks, but he seemed to be deliberately choosing deeper pools where his hooves wouldn't leave clear impressions. Eventually, they reached a place where the creek narrowed between two large boulders. Beyond them, the water cascaded down from a higher elevation, forming a small but noisy waterfall. There was no obvious path forward. Monarch stopped, turning his head to look at a nearly invisible game trail leading up the steep bank to their right. It was narrow and treacherous, not a path Thomas would ever have attempted on horseback. "You can't be serious," Thomas muttered. Monarch nickered softly as if encouraging him. "If you break both our necks, Sarah will never forgive me," Thomas warned. But he gave the horse his head, trusting the animal's judgment despite his misgivings. Monarch began to climb, picking his way up the steep incline with delicate precision. His hooves found purchase on ledges Thomas could barely see, navigating the treacherous path as confidently as if it were a well-maintained road. Thomas clung to the saddle, trying to stay balanced and not interfere with the horse's movements. When they finally reached the top, Thomas was amazed to find himself on a small plateau hidden from the valley below. A circle of ancient stones surrounded a grassy clearing, with the remnants of an old structure, perhaps a shepherd's hut, crumbling against the hillside. "What is this place?" Thomas wondered aloud, dismounting to give Monarch a rest. His legs felt wobbly after the intense ride. The horse moved immediately to the center of the stone circle, lowering his head to sniff at something on the ground. Thomas followed, curious. There, half buried in the earth, was a metal plate about the size of a dinner platter. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, partially obscured by dirt and moss. Thomas knelt, brushing away some of the debris. "These markings," he murmured, tracing a finger over the unusual patterns. They weren't like any writing he'd ever seen, not English letters or any foreign alphabet he could recognize. They seemed to be geometric designs, arranged in concentric circles around a central shape that resembled a horse with wings. Monarch pawed at the ground beside the plate, his hoof making a hollow sound. Thomas looked up, meeting the horse's gaze again. "There's something underneath, isn't there?" he asked. "Something hidden." Using a flat stone as a makeshift shovel, Thomas began to excavate around the metal plate. As he cleared away more dirt, he realized the plate was actually the top of a cylindrical container embedded in the ground. With considerable effort, He managed to loosen it enough to lift. Inside was a leather pouch, surprisingly well preserved despite being buried. Thomas opened it carefully, finding a bundle of yellowed papers covered in the same strange symbols as the plate, along with diagrams and what appeared to be scientific equations. One sheet, however, contained recognizable English text, a letter dated nearly 30 years earlier. "To whoever finds this cache," Thomas read aloud, "if you are reading these words, then you have been led here by one of our equine assets. Consider yourself fortunate. They choose their partners carefully." Thomas glanced at Monarch, who stood watching him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Project Pegasus was established in 1892 to explore the possibility of enhancing animals for military purposes. Our greatest success came not through artificial means, but through the discovery of a unique bloodline of horses possessing remarkable abilities, enhanced strength, speed, intelligence, and other traits that defy conventional explanation. The government sought to weaponize these animals. I sought to protect them. My colleagues branded me a traitor when I released 6 of our test subjects into the civilian population. By the time you read this, I will likely be dead or imprisoned. The horse that brought you here is special, the culmination of our research. Not a weapon, but a thinking being deserving of respect and protection. The tracking device in its neck is how they will try to reclaim it. Instructions for safely removing it are included in these papers. Choose wisely what you do with this knowledge. There are those who would kill for it. With hope for the future, Dr. Eleanor Winters, Chief Researcher, Project Pegasus. Thomas sat back on his heels, stunned by what he'd just read. He looked up at Monarch, seeing the horse in an entirely new light. "You're not just special," he whispered. "You're extraordinary." Monarch nickered softly, stepping forward to nuzzle Thomas's shoulder. "And you chose me." Thomas shook his head in wonder. "But why?" "I'm just a failing farmer with nothing to offer." As if in response, Monarch gently butted his head against Thomas's chest, directly over his heart. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles. The men in black had crossed the creek and were now driving along the road that skirted the base of the hill. Thomas quickly gathered the papers, returning them to the pouch. "We can't stay here," he said, rising to his feet. "And I can't go home, not yet. Not until I understand how to remove that tracking device and make sure Sarah and the children are safe." He looked at the position of the sun, calculating the time. It was mid-afternoon now. "We need to find somewhere to hole up until nightfall. Then maybe we can circle back to town and find Doc Williams. He might be able to help with that chip." Thomas mounted Monarch again, the leather pouch secured inside his jacket. As they prepared to leave the plateau, he realized something had changed between them. Before, he had been riding a gifted horse. Now he was partnering with an intelligent being, one that had chosen him for reasons he didn't yet understand. "Let's go, friend," he said, patting Monarch's neck with newfound respect. "We've got a long road ahead." Monarch snorted in agreement, then turned and picked his way down a different path from the one they had ascended. This one even less visible but somehow more stable. As they descended, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if the letter was true, if Monarch really was the product of some secret government project. What other abilities might the horse possess, and how would those abilities change his life and the lives of his family forever? The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Thomas and Monarch made their way through the dense forest, avoiding roads and open spaces. Thomas had spent his childhood exploring these woods, but Monarch seemed to know them even better, choosing paths that kept them hidden from view while allowing for swift movement. "We need to find a place to rest until nightfall," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to the horse. To his surprise, Monarch changed direction immediately, heading deeper into the forest with purposeful strides. After about 20 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by the ruins of an old hunting cabin. Only stone foundations and a partial chimney remained, but the site offered decent cover from casual observation. A small spring bubbled nearby, providing fresh water. "Good choice," Thomas said, dismounting. He removed his jacket and spread it on the ground, then took out the leather pouch containing Dr. Winter's documents. Let's see if we can make sense of these instructions. While Monarch grazed nearby, Thomas pored over the papers. Most were filled with scientific jargon and those strange symbols, but one contained detailed diagrams of what appeared to be the tracking device implanted in Monarch's neck, along with English instructions for its removal. According to this, Thomas muttered, the device is designed to be removed only with specialized tools. Without them, attempting removal could cause... He swallowed hard. Severe neural damage. Monarch raised his head. His ears pricked forward attentively. Don't worry, Thomas assured him. We'll find a way to do this properly. Doc Williams might have the right tools, or know someone who does. As he continued studying the papers, Thomas discovered something even more remarkable. According to Dr. Winter's notes, the horses of Project Pegasus weren't just physically enhanced, they possessed cognitive abilities far beyond normal equines. They could understand human language completely, solve complex problems, and even develop deep emotional bonds with specific humans. Most astonishing of all, some had demonstrated abilities that defied scientific explanation, premonitions of danger, uncanny navigational skills, and in rare cases, capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Is all this true? Thomas asked, looking up at Monarch, who had moved closer and was now watching him intently. Can you really understand everything I'm saying? Monarch bowed his head once, unmistakably nodding. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Despite everything he'd witnessed, seeing this deliberate communication was staggering. And you chose me? Why? The horse stepped forward, gently nuzzling the pocket where Thomas had kept the banknote Cooper had given him, the one settling his debt. Cooper, Thomas realized, this has something to do with him, doesn't it? He knows what you are. Monarch nodded again, then pawed at the ground 3 times. 3 days, Thomas interpreted. Cooper's deadline for my answer about the land. His mind raced, connecting the pieces. He wants my farm because of something to do with Project Pegasus, doesn't he? Something hidden there, like the cache we found on the plateau. Monarch nickered softly, as if encouraging Thomas's deductions. And you escaped from him, somehow found your way to my farm, then engineered that whole incident with the mice to ensure Cooper would give you to me. Thomas shook his head in amazement. But why me? What's so special about Thomas Miller? The horse had no way to answer such a complex question, and instead simply lowered his head to nudge Thomas's chest again, the same gesture as before, directly over his heart. My character? You judged me worthy? Thomas laughed softly. Well, I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I'm up to whatever mission you've got in mind. I'm just trying to save my farm and protect my family. As the sun began to set, Thomas carefully repacked the documents. We should wait another hour or so before heading back toward town, he said. Once it's fully dark, we'll have better chances of slipping past those government men. Monarch nodded again, then unexpectedly lowered himself to the ground, lying on his side. What are you doing? Thomas asked, puzzled. The horse remained still, looking at Thomas expectantly. You want me to lie down with you? Thomas guessed. Another nod. Confused but curious, Thomas settled on the ground next to Monarch, leaning his back against the horse's warm side. The moment he made contact, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The day's events, the wild ride, the chase, the discoveries, had pushed his body to its limits without him even realizing it. Just a short rest, Thomas murmured, his eyelids growing heavy. Wake me if you hear anything. He drifted into sleep and immediately began to dream. But these weren't ordinary dreams. They were vivid, structured images flowing into his mind with crystalline clarity. He saw Cooper's estate from above, as if flying over it, then swooping down to focus on a specific building, a modernized barn set apart from the main house. Inside were laboratory equipment, computers, and cages. Men in white coats moved between workstations, examining data on screens. The vision shifted to his own farm, diving beneath the surface of his north field to reveal something massive buried there, a metal structure of some kind, untouched for decades. Then he was seeing his own house, Sarah and the children inside, worried about his absence but safe for the moment. 2 black cars were parked on the road leading to his property, watching and waiting. Finally, the dream showed him Doc Williams's office, where the veterinarian was speaking urgently to a woman Thomas didn't recognize, middle-aged, with silver streaks in her dark hair and an air of authority. The woman showed Williams' identification, and he responded by pointing in the direction Thomas and Monarch had fled. Thomas jerked awake, his heart pounding. The clearing was now dark, illuminated only by the rising moon and a blanket of stars overhead. Monarch was standing again, alert and watching Thomas with those intelligent eyes. "Was that... Did you show me those things?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Monarch nodded, pawing the ground impatiently. "Those weren't just dreams. They were real, happening right now." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this new revelation. "You can see these things somehow and share them with me?" Another nod. "So Cooper is involved with Project Pegasus. He's continuing their work, and there's something buried on my farm." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "That's why he wants my land so badly." Monarch snorted in affirmation. "And Doc Williams, he's talking to someone about us. Not one of the men in black suits, but someone else." Thomas frowned. "Can we trust her? Is she trying to help us or capture you?" In response, Monarch walked to Thomas's side and nudged him toward the saddle. "Time to go, huh? But where?" Thomas glanced up at the star-filled sky. "If we can't trust Williams, and we can't go home." The horse pawed at the leather pouch containing the documents. Thomas pulled out the papers again, rifling through them in the dim moonlight until he found a page he hadn't noticed before. A map, showing locations throughout the country marked with the same winged horse symbol. One was circled in faded ink with a notation beside it. "Safe Haven, Eleanor." Dr. Winters had a backup plan, Thomas realized. Somewhere the government and Cooper wouldn't look. He squinted at the map, trying to determine where the circled location was in relation to their current position. "It's about 50 miles east of here. That's at least a day's journey, maybe more." Monarch nickered softly, nudging Thomas again. "You're right," Thomas agreed, mounting the horse. "We need to get moving. But first, I need to get word to Sarah somehow. I can't just disappear without telling her what's happening." As they set off through the moonlit forest, Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. The safest option would be to write a note and find someone trustworthy to deliver it. But who could he trust? The entire town would be buzzing with gossip about Thomas Miller and Nathaniel Cooper's prized horse by now, and those government agents would be watching for any contact. Monarch moved with even greater confidence in the darkness, his hooves finding sure footing despite the lack of light. Thomas marveled at yet another extraordinary ability. Perfect night vision, perhaps, or some other sense humans lacked. As they approached the outskirts of Millfield, Thomas could see the main street was mostly deserted. A few lights still burned in windows, but the general store was closed, as was Doc Williams's office. No sign of the black cars, but that didn't mean they weren't watching from a distance. "We need to find someone who can get a message to Sarah," Thomas whispered. "Someone who won't attract attention." Monarch slowed, then deliberately turned toward a small cottage at the edge of town, the home of Mrs. Abernathy, the schoolteacher who had taught Thomas as a boy and now taught his children. She was a widow in her 60s, respected by everyone and beholden to no one, not even Cooper. "Mrs. Abernathy?" Thomas questioned softly. "Yes, that might work. She's always been kind to my family." They approached the cottage cautiously. A lamp still burned in the front window, casting a warm glow onto the small garden. Thomas dismounted, instructing Monarch to wait in the shadows while he crept forward and tapped gently on the window. After a moment, the curtain parted, and Mrs. Abernathy's surprised face appeared. Her eyes widened at the sight of Thomas, then narrowed with concern. She gestured toward the back of the house, then disappeared from the window. Thomas made his way to the rear door, which opened before he could knock. "Thomas Miller," Mrs. Abernathy whispered. "Half the county's looking for you, including some very serious men with government credentials. What on earth have you gotten yourself into?" "It's complicated, Mrs. Abernathy," Thomas whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "May I come in? I need your help." The elderly school teacher hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Quickly then," she said, her voice low but steady. "There have been strangers asking questions all afternoon." As Thomas slipped inside, Mrs. Abernathy closed and locked the door behind him. Her kitchen was modest but immaculate, with herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and a small fire crackling in the stove. The familiar scents of baking bread and chamomile tea brought Thomas an unexpected sense of comfort. "Sit," Mrs. Abernathy instructed, pointing to a chair at her kitchen table, "and explain why government agents are inquiring about one of my former pupils, a quiet farmer who's never been in trouble a day in his life." Thomas sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "It's about the horse," he began, then hesitated. How much could he safely tell her? Mrs. Abernathy poured him a cup of tea, studying his face with sharp eyes that had evaluated generations of schoolchildren. "Nathaniel Cooper's thoroughbred," she stated matter-of-factly. "The one you were seen riding into town this morning at a speed that, according to Mr. Green, would make a locomotive engineer jealous." Despite everything, Thomas felt a small smile tug at his lips. News traveled fast in Millfield. "Cooper gave me the horse yesterday," he explained, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "But there's more to it than that. The horse, Monarch, he's special, different, and there are people who want him back." Mrs. Abernathy sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "Different how?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I know this will sound crazy, but he's not a normal horse. He's smarter than any animal I've ever encountered. He can understand human speech completely. He can—" Thomas faltered, realizing how fantastic his claims would sound. He was part of some secret government project years ago. That's why they're looking for him. For us. To his surprise, Mrs. Abernathy didn't immediately dismiss his story. Instead, she nodded slowly, a strange expression crossing her face. "Project Pegasus," she murmured. Thomas nearly spilled his tea. "You know about it?" "Not much," she admitted. "Just whispers from long ago. My late husband worked for the government before we moved here. He never spoke directly about his work, but sometimes in his sleep." She trailed off, lost in memory for a moment. "He mentioned Project Pegasus once or twice. Something about horses that weren't just horses." Thomas stared at her, stunned by this unexpected connection. "Then you believe me?" "I believe you believe it," she replied carefully. "And I've lived long enough to know the government keeps many secrets, some stranger than fiction." She leaned forward. "But what do you want from me, Thomas? I'm an old school teacher. I can't protect you from government agents." "I need to get a message to Sarah," Thomas explained. "I can't go home, it's too dangerous. Those men might be watching the farm, but Sarah needs to know I'm all right and—" He hesitated. "She needs to be warned about what's buried in our north field." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose. "Buried?" "Some kind of structure," Thomas said. "It's why Cooper wants our land so badly. I think it's connected to Project Pegasus, maybe an old facility or something containing information about the program." "And how do you know about this buried structure?" she asked skeptically. Thomas hesitated again. How could he explain Monarch's ability to share visions without sounding completely deranged? "I have reason to believe it's there," he said finally. "Cooper knows it too. That's why he's been so determined to buy our farm, even though the land is barely productive anymore." Mrs. Abernathy studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "I'll take a message to Sarah tomorrow. I can say I'm checking on Emma's reading assignments. No one would question that. But what will you do, Thomas? You can't run forever." "There's a place," Thomas said, thinking of the map in the leather pouch. "A safe haven, according to these documents I found. About 50 miles east of here. I'm hoping to find answers there. Maybe even help removing the tracking device from Monarch's neck. And then? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. Protect my family somehow. Expose Cooper's connection to all this, maybe. He met the schoolteacher's gaze. One step at a time. Mrs. Abernathy rose from the table, fetching paper and pencil from a drawer. Write your message. Keep it simple. Nothing that would raise alarm if intercepted. I'll make you something to eat for your journey. As Thomas penned a carefully worded note to Sarah, explaining that he was safe but needed to be away for a few days, Mrs. Abernathy packed bread, cheese, and dried fruit into a small cloth sack. She added a flask of water and, after a moment's consideration, a small knife. My husband's, she explained, noticing Thomas's questioning look. He always said a man traveling alone should have some protection. Thomas folded the note and handed it to Mrs. Abernathy. Tell Sarah I love her and the children. Tell her... He swallowed hard. Tell her I'll come home as soon as I can. The elderly woman nodded, tucking the note into her apron pocket. Where is this remarkable horse now? Waiting in the shadows behind your garden, Thomas replied. He's good at staying hidden. Mrs. Abernathy's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. I'd like to see him before you go. If he's as extraordinary as you claim, it would be a shame to miss the opportunity. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. They slipped out the back door into the moonlit garden. Thomas whistled softly, and Monarch emerged from the darkness like a ghost, his coat silvered by moonlight. Mrs. Abernathy drew in a sharp breath. My goodness, she whispered. He's magnificent. Monarch approached them calmly, stopping a few feet away. His intelligent eyes assessed Mrs. Abernathy carefully before he inclined his head in what was unmistakably a bow of greeting. The schoolteacher's hand flew to her mouth. Did he just bow to me? He understands everything we're saying, Thomas confirmed. And he seems to be a good judge of character. Mrs. Abernathy extended a tentative hand, which Monarch gently nuzzled. Remarkable, she breathed. Truly remarkable. She turned to Thomas, her expression suddenly serious. You must protect him, Thomas. If people like Cooper get their hands on such an extraordinary creature... I know, Thomas agreed grimly. That's why we need to reach this safe haven. Mrs. Abernathy handed him the sack of provisions. Go then. Stay off the main roads. And Thomas, she added as he mounted Monarch, remember that extraordinary gifts often come with extraordinary responsibilities. Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy, for everything. Godspeed, Thomas Miller, she whispered as horse and rider melted into the darkness. They traveled east under the cover of night, Monarch picking his way confidently through fields and forests, avoiding roads and farmhouses. The moon provided enough light for Thomas to occasionally consult Dr. Winter's map, confirming they were heading in the right direction. As they crested a hill shortly before dawn, Thomas reined Monarch to a halt, gazing at the landscape spread out before them. They had covered impressive ground, at least 15 miles by his estimation, and were now well beyond the boundaries of familiar territory. We should find somewhere to rest during daylight, Thomas said, patting Monarch's neck. It'll be safer to travel again after sunset. The horse snorted in agreement, then tensed suddenly, ears pricking forward. Thomas followed his gaze and spotted what had caught Monarch's attention. Headlights on a distant road, moving slowly. Even at this distance, Thomas recognized the deliberate patrol pattern of the black cars. They're still searching, he murmured. How far does their reach extend? Monarch pawed the ground anxiously, then turned away from the lights, heading toward a dense copse of trees to their right. Thomas let him choose their path, trusting the horse's instincts. Within the trees, they discovered a small cave formed by a rocky outcropping, large enough for both of them and well hidden from casual observation. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Thomas unsaddled Monarch, giving the horse a chance to rest properly. We've got a long journey ahead, Thomas said, spreading his jacket on the cave floor and settling down with his back against the cool stone. He took out the leather pouch again, studying the map more carefully in the growing light. According to this, the safe haven is somewhere in these hills. He pointed to a range of low mountains in the distance. Probably another day's journey at least. Monarch moved to stand beside him, looking at the map with apparent interest. Thomas found himself wondering again about the horse's extraordinary intelligence. How much did Monarch really understand about their situation? About Project Pegasus and his own origins? "I wish you could talk," Thomas said softly. "There's so much I want to ask you." Monarch nudged Thomas's shoulder gently, then settled on the ground beside him, just as he had in the forest clearing. Understanding the invitation, Thomas leaned against the horse's warm side and closed his eyes. This time, he was prepared for the visions that flowed into his mind. Images of Sarah receiving Mrs. Abernathy's visit, of the government agents expanding their search perimeter, of Cooper in his study poring over old documents with a worried expression. The scenes shifted and blurred, some seeming more like memories than current events. Thomas saw a younger Dr. Eleanor Winters working with a small herd of special horses, including a young Monarch. He witnessed moments from Monarch's training, glimpsed the bond between horse and researcher growing over time. Then came darker images. Men in military uniforms arguing with Dr. Winters, plans for weaponizing the horses, Dr. Winters' desperate plot to free them. The final vision before Thomas drifted into true sleep was the most puzzling of all. A massive underground chamber beneath his north field, filled with strange equipment and documents, and at its center, a stasis chamber containing what appeared to be a horse, but not like any horse Thomas had ever seen. This one had wings. Thomas awoke with a start, sunlight streaming through the cave entrance. His mind still reeled from the vision of the winged horse. Not a normal horse with artificial wings attached, but a creature that seemed to have been born that way, its wings as natural a part of its anatomy as its legs or tail. It had to be a dream, a fantasy his exhausted brain had conjured from the stress and strangeness of the past 2 days. And yet, Monarch was watching him with those knowing eyes, as if waiting for Thomas to process what he had seen. "Was that real?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with sleep. "A horse with actual wings?" Monarch nodded once, definitively. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. "And it's hidden under my farm, in my north field?" Another nod. "Good Lord," Thomas whispered. The implications were staggering. If such a creature existed, if the government had somehow created or discovered it, no wonder Cooper was so desperate to acquire his land. No wonder mysterious men in black suits were chasing them across the countryside. Thomas suddenly understood the gravity of his situation with new clarity. This wasn't just about a remarkably intelligent horse or a land dispute with a wealthy neighbor. He had stumbled into something far larger, something with implications he could barely comprehend. "Is it alive?" he asked. "The winged horse in that chamber?" Monarch tilted his head slightly, then nodded, but with a hesitant quality that suggested uncertainty. "You're not sure," Thomas interpreted. It was in some kind of stasis, suspended animation. Not fully alive, but not dead either. The horse snorted in apparent agreement. Thomas's stomach growled, reminding him of more immediate concerns. He reached for the provisions Mrs. Abernathy had provided, breaking off a piece of bread and cutting a small slice of cheese. As he ate, he studied the map again, tracing their route with a finger. "We've made good progress," he told Monarch, who was now stretching his legs near the cave entrance. "If we continue at this pace, we should reach these hills by tomorrow morning." Thomas finished his modest breakfast and repacked his supplies. The sun was high now, suggesting it was close to noon. They would need to remain hidden until dusk. "We should rest while we can," Thomas said, settling back against the cave wall. Tonight will be another long journey. But rest proved elusive as Thomas's mind churned with questions. What was Project Pegasus really trying to accomplish? How had they created, or found, a horse with wings? And what did it all have to do with him, a struggling farmer whose only concern until 2 days ago had been saving his family's land? As if sensing his troubled thoughts, Monarch moved to his side again, lowering himself to the ground. Thomas hesitated only briefly before leaning against the horse, and once again, images began flowing into his mind. This time, he saw Dr. Winters and her team in an underground facility, gathered around a large object draped in cloth. When the covering was removed, gasps echoed through the chamber. There, sedated on an examination table, lay a horse with partially developed wings extending from its shoulders. Small, not yet functional, but unmistakably real. The vision shifted, showing years of research, more equines with varying degrees of wing development, and finally, success. A fully formed specimen capable of actual flight. Thomas watched in awe as the creature soared through a massive underground chamber, its wingspan impressive, its movements graceful despite the confined space. Then came darker scenes. Military officials demanding weaponization, Dr. Winters resisting, heated arguments about the ethical implications of what they had discovered. The flying horse, which the researchers called Pegasus Prime, became increasingly agitated as tensions rose, eventually injuring several handlers during an escape attempt. The final vision showed Dr. Winters making a heartbreaking decision. Pegasus Prime was too dangerous, too powerful to be weaponized, but too valuable to destroy. The solution: a stasis chamber, hidden beneath an unremarkable farm far from prying eyes, where the creature could remain safely contained until a time when humanity might be ready for such a discovery. That farm, Thomas realized with a chill, was his land. Purchased by his grandfather decades ago from a distressed seller who had insisted on unusual terms, including a covenant that the North Field never be excavated below a certain depth. The visions faded, leaving Thomas breathless and disoriented. This was beyond anything he could have imagined, beyond what any rational person would believe. And yet, sitting beside a horse that could share memories and thoughts, Thomas couldn't dismiss it as fantasy. "My grandfather," he whispered. He knew, didn't he? He was part of this somehow. Monarch blinked slowly, neither confirming nor denying. "And now Cooper has discovered the truth," Thomas continued, thinking aloud. "Maybe he found old records, or maybe he was connected to the project all along. Either way, he wants what's hidden beneath my farm." The implications were terrifying. If Cooper succeeded in acquiring his land and excavating the stasis chamber, Pegasus Prime would fall into the hands of a man willing to exploit such a discovery for profit or power. And judging by the visions, the winged horse was not a creature to be controlled or contained easily. Hours passed as Thomas grappled with these revelations. By late afternoon, he had reached a decision. "We need to get to this safe haven," he told Monarch as he began saddling the horse. "But afterward, we have to return home. Whatever's buried under my farm can't fall into Cooper's hands, or the government's for that matter." Monarch nickered softly, nudging Thomas's shoulder in what felt like approval. As dusk approached, they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary. Thomas checked the surrounding area carefully before mounting, making sure no search parties were visible on the horizon. The countryside was quiet, bathed in the golden light of sunset. "Let's go," Thomas said, and Monarch moved out, picking up a steady pace that ate up the miles without overtaxing his strength. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest and consult the map. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached the hills marked on Dr. Winters's map. By dawn, they found themselves at the base of a steep incline, a barely visible trail winding upward through dense vegetation. "This must be it," Thomas said, dismounting to give Monarch a break. "The safe haven should be somewhere up there." As they began their ascent on foot, Thomas leading Monarch by the reins, he couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Several times he paused, scanning their surroundings, but saw nothing out of place, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bird or small animal going about its morning business. Halfway up the hill, the trail narrowed, forcing them to edge along a precarious ledge. Thomas's farm-toughened boots slipped on loose gravel, nearly sending him plummeting down the steep slope. Monarch reacted instantly, catching the back of Thomas's jacket in his teeth and pulling him to safety. "Thanks, boy," Thomas gasped, heart hammering in his chest. That was too close. Monarch snorted in agreement, then froze, ears pricked forward. A moment later, Thomas heard it too, the distant sound of an engine, then another growing louder. "They've found us," he whispered, peering down the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he could see two black cars approaching along a dirt road that skirted the base of the hill. Men were already exiting the vehicles, pointing up toward the trail. "How did they track us?" Thomas wondered aloud. "We've been so careful." His hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, where he'd stored the documents from the cache. Of course, if Monarch had a tracking device, might the leather pouch or its contents have one as well? There was no time to investigate. The men were already starting up the trail, moving with the efficiency of trained operatives. "We need to hurry," Thomas urged, turning back to the path ahead. "The safe haven can't be much farther." They pushed forward, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous. Thomas's legs burned with the effort, his lungs straining in the thinning air. Monarch moved with sure-footed determination beside him, occasionally helping to steady Thomas on particularly difficult stretches. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, they rounded a bend and found themselves facing what appeared to be a solid rock wall covered in vines and moss. Thomas's heart sank. Had they come all this way for nothing? Monarch, however, approached the wall confidently, pushing his nose against a specific section of the rock face. To Thomas's astonishment, a portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden entrance large enough for a horse and rider to pass through. "A secret door," Thomas breathed. "Clever." They slipped inside just as shouts echoed from further down the trail. The door swung shut behind them, plunging them into momentary darkness before soft lights automatically illuminated a tunnel leading deeper into the hillside. Thomas and Monarch followed the tunnel, which gradually widened into a large cavern. What Thomas saw there stopped him in his tracks, his mouth falling open in shock and wonder. They had found the safe haven, but it was nothing like he had expected. The cavern before them had been transformed into a sophisticated living and working space. Modern equipment, computers, laboratory apparatus, and monitoring systems lined the walls. Soft, ambient lighting emanated from fixtures embedded in the rock ceiling. In the center stood a large circular platform surrounded by what appeared to be medical equipment, and beyond that, several comfortable living quarters had been carved into the stone. But what truly stunned Thomas were the occupants. 3 horses, each as magnificent as Monarch, stood watching their arrival with intelligent, assessing gazes, and beside them, rising from a desk cluttered with papers, was a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair. The woman Thomas had seen in his vision, talking to Doc Williams. "You made it," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent Thomas couldn't place. "We were beginning to worry." Thomas remained frozen at the tunnel entrance, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Who are you?" he finally managed. The woman approached, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She was older than Thomas had first thought, perhaps in her 60s, with deep lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Winters," she replied, extending her hand. "Though I imagine Monarch has already told you about me, in his way." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "Dr. Winters, but you, in the documents, that letter was written 30 years ago. I thought you were dead? Imprisoned?" She smiled wryly. "The government certainly preferred everyone to think so. It made it easier for me to continue my work here, off the grid and away from those who would misuse it." Monarch moved past Thomas to greet the other horses, exchanging soft nickers that somehow seemed more meaningful than ordinary equine communication. The 3 newcomers, a dappled gray, a deep bay, and a striking black, approached Monarch with obvious familiarity. "Your friends?" Thomas asked Monarch, who nodded in response. "The last of the original Project Pegasus subjects," Dr. Winters explained, "each with their own unique abilities. Monarch is our communicator, the only one who can share thoughts and memories directly with humans. Atlas," she gestured to the gray, "has incredible strength. Tempest, the black, can influence weather patterns in a limited area, and Phoenix, the bay, has remarkable healing abilities. Thomas felt lightheaded. It was one thing to experience Monarch's extraordinary nature firsthand, but to learn there were others, each with different powers, made the situation all the more surreal. "Please sit," Dr. Winters said, gesturing to a comfortable chair near her desk. "You look exhausted and we have much to discuss. Government agents are already searching the hillside, though they won't find this entrance without help." Thomas sank gratefully into the chair. "How did you know we were coming? And how did you know about the agents?" "I've had my eye on you since Monarch chose you," she replied, pouring him a glass of water from a pitcher. "As for the agents, I have sources, including your veterinarian friend who recognized me from old project files but decided to help rather than hinder." "Doc Williams," Thomas murmured. "So he wasn't betraying us." "Quite the opposite. He delayed the search parties as long as he could, sending them in the wrong direction initially." Dr. Winters sat across from him. "But we don't have much time. Cooper knows more than he should about Project Pegasus, and he's determined to gain access to what's hidden beneath your farm." "The winged horse," Thomas said. "Pegasus Prime." Dr. Winters' expression tightened. "So Monarch showed you." "Yes, our greatest achievement and our greatest mistake. A true Pegasus, not just an enhanced equine, but a genetic marvel that should never have been possible." She shook her head. "We went too far, played God with genetics, and ended up creating something we couldn't control." "Is it dangerous?" Thomas asked. "Immensely," Dr. Winters confirmed. "Not malevolent, but powerful beyond imagining, and not entirely stable, mentally. The modifications that gave it wings also affected its brain chemistry. It became erratic, sometimes violent. We had no choice but to place it in stasis until we could find a solution." "And you hid it under my grandfather's farm," Thomas said, pieces falling into place. "He was involved somehow, wasn't he?" Dr. Winters nodded. "Harold Miller was our facility manager. Not a scientist, but a practical man who understood both security and discretion. When we needed to hide Pegasus Prime from those who would weaponize it, Harold offered his family land. We constructed the chamber in secret. Then he purchased the farm as a cover." Thomas absorbed this revelation about his grandfather, a man he'd known only as a stern but fair farmer with little tolerance for nonsense. The idea that he'd been involved in a top-secret government project seemed inconceivable. "Why are you telling me all this?" Thomas asked. "Why did Monarch choose me?" "Because you're Harold's grandson," Dr. Winters said simply. "Because the same practicality and moral compass that made him trustworthy runs in your blood. And because, without your help, everything we've worked for could be lost." "My help? What can I possibly do against Cooper and the government?" Dr. Winters leaned forward. "Cooper isn't working with the government. He's working against them, using knowledge he stole from old project files. He's built his own research facility, hoping to create enhanced equines he can control and profit from. But he lacks a key component. Pegasus Prime's genetic material," Thomas guessed. "Precisely. With it, he could potentially breed a new generation of winged horses, docile ones, obedient to him alone." Her expression hardened. "The government, meanwhile, still wants to weaponize the technology. Neither can be allowed to succeed." Thomas rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "So what's the plan?" "I'm just a farmer." "A farmer with access to the land where Pegasus Prime is hidden," Dr. Winters countered. "And now a farmer with a remarkable bond with Monarch. Something neither Cooper nor the government anticipated." She rose, walking to a large computer screen that displayed a complex diagram of what appeared to be the stasis chamber beneath Thomas's farm. "We need to move Pegasus Prime before either Cooper or the government can reach it. The chamber has remained untouched for decades, but it won't stay secure much longer, not with Cooper so close to acquiring your land." "Move it where?" Thomas asked. "And how? From what I saw in those visions, that stasis chamber is massive." "Here," Dr. Winters replied. "This facility was built specifically as a secondary containment location, should the first ever be compromised. As for how, she turned to face him directly. That's where you come in. The chamber's security system was keyed to Harold's DNA, and by extension, yours. Only a Miller can authorize the stasis field to be deactivated for transport. Thomas stood, pacing the cavern floor as he processed everything. So I need to go back to my farm, somehow access this underground chamber without Cooper or the government noticing, deactivate a stasis field containing a potentially unstable winged horse, and then… What? How do we transport something like that? We have equipment, Dr. Winters assured him. And more importantly, we have help. She gestured to the 4 horses, who were watching their conversation with evident understanding. Their combined abilities, Monarch's communication, Atlas's strength, Tempest's weather manipulation to provide cover, and Phoenix's healing if anything goes wrong, make the impossible possible. Thomas stopped pacing, turning to face Monarch. You knew all this from the beginning, didn't you? This was always the plan, to bring me here, to convince me to help. Monarch approached, lowering his head to meet Thomas's gaze directly. There was an apology in those intelligent eyes, but also a plea. He didn't manipulate you, Dr. Winters said softly. He chose you because he sensed you were worthy of trust. The decision to help must still be yours. Thomas thought of Sarah and the children, of their farm, struggling but still home. He thought of Cooper and his ruthless determination to acquire the land at any cost. He thought of the government agents chasing them across the countryside. Most of all, he thought of what might happen if Pegasus Prime fell into the wrong hands. I'll help, he said finally. But my family comes first. I need to know they'll be safe. Dr. Winters nodded. We can arrange that. In fact, she glanced at her watch. Your wife and children should be arriving at their extraction point right about now. What? Thomas exclaimed. What extraction point? Mrs. Abernathy didn't just deliver your message, Dr. Winters explained. She also gave Sarah instructions and the means to bring your family to a safe location. One of our associates is escorting them as we speak. Thomas felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief that his family would be safe, anger that decisions had been made without his knowledge, gratitude that someone had thought to protect them when he couldn't. You've been planning this for a long time, he said. Not quite a question. Since Cooper first showed interest in your land, Dr. Winters confirmed. We've been watching, waiting for the right moment to act. Monarch's decision to bond with you accelerated our timeline. Thomas looked around the cavern, at the advanced technology, the 4 extraordinary horses, the elderly scientist who had dedicated her life to protecting powerful secrets. It was all so far removed from his simple existence as a farmer, and yet somehow he now stood at the center of it all. When do we leave? He asked. Tonight, Dr. Winters replied. Once your family is secure and we've confirmed the government search parties have moved on. We'll need to work quickly. Cooper's offer expires tomorrow, and he's not a man who handles rejection well. Thomas nodded, squaring his shoulders. Then we'd better start preparing. As Dr. Winters began outlining their plan in detail, Thomas caught Monarch watching him. The horse's gaze held something new, not just intelligence, but respect. Whatever happened next, Thomas realized, their fates were now inextricably linked. And somehow, that knowledge gave him strength. Night fell over the hillside as Thomas, Dr. Winters, and the 4 remarkable horses prepared for their mission. The safe haven bustled with activity, equipment being packed, maps studied, contingency plans discussed in hushed tones. Thomas had spent the afternoon learning everything he could about the stasis chamber beneath his farm, memorizing access codes and procedures that his grandfather had established decades ago. The extraction was successful, Dr. Winters announced, setting down a radio handset. Your family is safe at our secondary location. Sarah sends her love and says the children are treating it like an adventure. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. Can I speak with them? Not directly, too risky, Dr. Winters replied. But they'll be waiting for you when this is over. As the final preparations were made, Dr. Winters approached Thomas with a small metallic device. This will remove Monarch's tracking chip, she explained, demonstrating the procedure on a model. It's painless, but it needs to be done precisely. Are you ready? Thomas nodded, and Monarch stepped forward, lowering his head to expose the area on his neck where the chip was embedded. Following Dr. Winter's instructions, Thomas placed the device against Monarch's skin and pressed a button. There was a soft clicking sound, and when he removed the device, a tiny metallic object rested in its collection chamber. "That's it?" Thomas asked, surprised by the simplicity. "Technology has advanced considerably since those chips were implanted," Dr. Winters said with a small smile. "Now, Monarch can move freely without being tracked." With that final task completed, they gathered at the hidden entrance. The plan was audacious. They would travel through the night using back roads and forest paths, arrive at Thomas's farm before dawn, access the underground chamber, and transport Pegasus Prime back to the safe haven, all before Cooper could execute his plan to seize the property. "Remember," Dr. Winters cautioned as they prepared to leave, "Cooper has resources we can only guess at, and the government agents are still searching. This won't be easy." Thomas mounted Monarch, feeling the horse's powerful muscles tense beneath him. "Nothing worth doing ever is," he replied, surprising himself with his own resolve. They set out under cover of darkness, Dr. Winters riding Atlas while Phoenix and Tempest followed without riders. Their journey was swift but cautious, with Tempest occasionally summoning patches of fog or light rain to obscure their passage when they needed to cross open areas. Thomas marveled at this ability. The black horse seemed to manipulate atmospheric conditions through sheer will, creating localized weather phenomena that defied explanation. As they traveled, Dr. Winters shared more about Project Pegasus and its history. "It began innocently enough," she explained, studying unusual genetic traits in certain horse bloodlines. "But when we discovered the potential for enhanced abilities, the military took interest. Funding poured in, along with pressure to develop capabilities that could be weaponized. And Pegasus Prime was the culmination," Thomas said. Dr. Winters nodded grimly. "A combination of genetic engineering and something else, something we still don't fully understand. The wings weren't mechanical additions. They grew naturally during development. It was as if we had activated dormant genetic coding that shouldn't have existed at all. Like the creatures from mythology actually existed once," Thomas suggested, thinking of the ancient Greek legends. "Perhaps," Dr. Winters conceded. "Or perhaps we tapped into something that was meant to remain dormant. Either way, the result was both magnificent and terrifying." Dawn was still an hour away when they reached the outskirts of Thomas's property. They paused at the edge of the woods, surveying the farm in the pre-dawn gloom. The house was dark, as expected with the family gone, but there was activity near the barn, flashlight beams moving in the darkness. "Cooper's men," Thomas whispered. "They're already here." Dr. Winters frowned. "Earlier than anticipated. We need to move quickly before they realize what we're after." Tempest stepped forward, pawing the ground, and suddenly a thick fog began rolling across the fields, obscuring everything in a ghostly white shroud. "That should slow them down," Dr. Winters said with approval. "Now the entrance to the chamber. Where is it?" "The north field, near the old oak tree," Thomas replied, leading them along the edge of the property to avoid detection. "My grandfather built a storm cellar there that supposedly leads to an old root storage area. I never went beyond the first level. He always kept it locked, said it wasn't safe." They reached the location without incident, the fog growing thicker with each passing minute. The storm cellar doors were sturdy despite their age, secured with a heavy padlock. "The key?" Dr. Winters asked. Thomas shook his head. "Never had one. My father didn't either, as far as I know." "Stand back," she instructed, nodding to Atlas. The powerful gray horse approached the padlock and, with precision that belied his size, applied pressure with his teeth. The metal groaned briefly before giving way with a snap. Inside, concrete steps led down to a simple cellar with stone walls and a dirt floor. An old lantern hung from a hook, which Dr. Winters lit to reveal wooden shelves lined with dusty canning jars and farm tools. "There must be another entrance," she murmured, examining the walls. "Harold wouldn't have made it obvious." Thomas ran his hands along the rough stone, remembering childhood visits to this cellar during tornado warnings. He'd always felt there was something strange about the place, an odd humming vibration sometimes, or the way his grandfather would stand in a specific corner as if guarding it. He moved to that corner now, pushing aside an old shelf. Behind it, the stones looked no different from the rest, but when Thomas pressed his palm against them, a soft blue light suddenly illuminated the mortar lines between the rocks. "DNA recognition," Dr. Winters breathed. "Just as I thought." The stone wall slid sideways with surprising quietness, revealing a sleek metal door with a numeric keypad. Dr. Winters nodded encouragingly as Thomas entered the code she had taught him, his grandfather's birthday, reversed, followed by the Greek letter pi to 3 decimal places. The door hissed open, exposing a sterile corridor that sloped gently downward, illuminated by recessed lighting that activated automatically as they entered. The horses followed without hesitation, their hooves making soft clicking sounds on the polished floor. "How deep does this go?" Thomas wondered aloud as they descended. "The chamber is approximately 60 feet below the surface," Dr. Winters replied, "deep enough to shield its energy signature from detection technology." After what seemed like a long journey downward, they reached another door, larger, heavier, with more sophisticated security measures. This one required not only a code, but a voice recognition component. "Your voice should work," Dr. Winters told Thomas. "Say, Miller Authorization Alpha 97. Thomas repeated the phrase, and after a moment's pause, the massive door began to slide open. Cool air rushed out, carrying a faint metallic scent. What lay beyond took Thomas's breath away. A vast chamber, at least the size of his entire barn, stretched before them. The walls were lined with monitoring equipment, much of it still operational despite decades of disuse. Soft blue lighting illuminated the space, focusing particularly on the chamber's centerpiece, a massive cylindrical tank filled with a clear, slightly luminescent fluid. And suspended within that fluid, motionless yet somehow radiating power, was Pegasus Prime. Its wings were folded against its body, easily 15 feet in span when extended, Thomas guessed. Unlike the pure white creature of mythology, this Pegasus was a deep, burnished gold, its coat seeming to shimmer even in stasis. It was larger than a normal horse, perhaps the size of a large draft horse, with a more pronounced musculature and a head that seemed somehow more refined, more intelligent in its structure. "My God," Thomas whispered, approaching the tank with reverence. "It's real. Very real," Dr. Winters confirmed, moving to a control panel. "And still stable, thankfully. The stasis field has maintained integrity all these years." The 4 enhanced horses spread out around the chamber, each taking a position as if they had rehearsed this moment many times. Monarch remained by Thomas's side, while Atlas positioned himself near a large piece of equipment that appeared to be some kind of transport mechanism. Phoenix moved to a medical station, and Tempest stood guard near the entrance. "We need to prepare the transport module," Dr. Winters explained, typing commands into the control panel. "Then you'll need to authorize the stasis field deactivation sequence. Once that begins, we'll have exactly 7 minutes to transfer Pegasus Prime before the reanimation process completes." "And if we're not done in 7 minutes?" Thomas asked. Dr. Winters met his gaze soberly. "Then we'll be facing a fully conscious and potentially disoriented Pegasus Prime without the benefit of containment. Not a scenario I'd care to experience." Before they could proceed further, Tempest suddenly whinnied in alarm. The sound echoed through the chamber, and a moment later they heard voices in the corridor behind them. "They've found the entrance," Dr. Winters said grimly. "Cooper must have known more than I thought." Thomas turned toward the door, his heart pounding. "Can we seal it?" "Not without activating emergency protocols that would compromise the stasis field," Dr. Winters replied, her fingers flying over the controls. "We need to proceed with the transfer immediately." As Thomas moved to the main control panel where he would need to authorize the deactivation, the voices grew louder. Then a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, flanked by armed men in tactical gear. Nathaniel Cooper stood surveying the chamber, his expression a mixture of triumph and covetousness. When he spotted Thomas, his lips curved in a cold smile. "Miller," he called, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I see you've saved me the trouble of finding this place myself. How thoughtful." Thomas stepped protectively in front of the control panel. "This doesn't belong to you, Cooper." "No," Cooper replied, advancing into the chamber. "Well, it doesn't belong to you either. But unlike you, I know how to use it, how to profit from it." His gaze shifted to Pegasus Prime, and his eyes gleamed with naked ambition. "Do you have any idea what that creature is worth? What someone would pay for control of such power?" Dr. Winters moved to stand beside Thomas. "We won't let you take it, Nathaniel." Cooper's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Dr. Winters, the reports of your demise were greatly exaggerated, it seems." He gestured to his men. "Secure the chamber, and be careful with those horses. They're more valuable than you might think." As the armed men spread out, Monarch, Atlas, Phoenix, and Tempest formed a protective circle around Thomas and Dr. Winters. The standoff was clear, neither side willing to back down, both aware of the extraordinary prize suspended in the tank behind them. "You have one chance to walk away," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "One chance to forget what you've seen here." Cooper laughed. "Or what? You'll set your pets on me? I've studied these animals for years, Miller. I know their capabilities and their limitations." "Do you?" Thomas asked quietly, his hand hovering over the control panel. "Do you really?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Cooper's face. He glanced at the stasis tank, then back at Thomas, calculating. "What are you going to do?" he demanded. "Release it? You wouldn't dare. That creature is unstable, dangerous even to its creators." "Perhaps," Thomas agreed. "But I'm a Miller. This has been our responsibility for 3 generations, and I'd rather see it free than in your hands." With that, he pressed his palm against the authorization panel, and the chamber filled with the sound of alarms as the stasis field began its deactivation sequence. 7 minutes to transfer Pegasus Prime, or face the consequences. The chamber erupted into chaos. Red warning lights pulsed in rhythm with the blaring alarms, and the luminescent fluid in the stasis tank began to drain, revealing more of Pegasus Prime's magnificent form. The countdown timer on the main console showed 6:42 and counting. "You fool!" Cooper shouted, his face contorted with rage. He signaled to his men. "Restrain them, now!" As the armed guards advanced, the 4 enhanced horses moved with astonishing coordination. Atlas charged 2 men approaching from the left, sending them flying backward with a powerful shoulder check. Tempest reared up, and suddenly the air in the chamber began to swirl violently, creating a localized windstorm that disoriented Cooper's men. Thomas and Dr. Winters worked frantically at the transport controls, preparing the module that would safely contain Pegasus Prime during relocation. "We need 3 more minutes to complete the preparations," Dr. Winters shouted over the commotion. "The transfer mechanism is powering up, but it's been dormant for decades." Cooper ducked behind a console, drawing a sleek black pistol from his jacket. "Stop the deactivation sequence," he demanded, taking aim at Dr. Winters, "or I'll ensure you don't leave this chamber alive." Monarch placed himself between Cooper and the scientists, his intelligent eyes fixed on the weapon. Thomas felt a sudden pressure in his mind, an urgent communication from the horse that wasn't in images this time, but a clear imperative. "Finish the transfer. We will protect you." One of Cooper's men managed to break through the defensive line and lunged at Thomas, tackling him to the ground. They grappled on the cold floor, rolling dangerously close to sensitive equipment. Thomas, hardened by years of farm labor, fought with desperate strength, but the guard was professionally trained and quickly gained the upper hand. Just as the man pinned Thomas, Phoenix appeared beside them. The bay horse lowered his head and gently touched his muzzle to Thomas's shoulder. Instantly, a surge of energy coursed through his body, washing away fatigue and pain. With renewed strength, Thomas pushed his attacker off and scrambled back to the controls. 5:17 on the countdown. "The transport module is ready," Dr. Winters announced, her fingers dancing across the keypad. "But we still need to align it with the stasis tank." Cooper had worked his way closer, keeping low and using the equipment as cover. Two of his men had regained their footing and were attempting to subdue Atlas, while a third was taking aim at Tempest with what looked like a tranquilizer gun. 4:53. "Listen to me," Cooper called out, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. "We don't need to be adversaries. Think about what we could accomplish together, Dr. Winters. Your knowledge, my resources, we could change the world." "The way you changed Monarch?" Dr. Winters retorted, not pausing in her work. "Exploiting these magnificent creatures for profit and power. Progress requires sacrifice," Cooper replied coldly, "and vision." "Your vision is short-sighted," Thomas said, aligning the transport module with the stasis tank. The two systems connected with a satisfying metallic clunk, and green lights flashed across the console. "You see weapons and profit. We see living beings worthy of respect." 4:12. The fluid had almost completely drained from the tank now, leaving Pegasus Prime suspended in a specialized harness. For the first time, Thomas could see the creature clearly. The powerful musculature of its body, the delicate yet strong structure of its folded wings, the regal shape of its head. Even unconscious, it radiated an aura of power and majesty that made his breath catch. And then, almost imperceptibly, one of its ears twitched. "It's starting to wake," Dr. Winters warned, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to initiate the transfer now." Thomas pressed the sequence of buttons she indicated, and with a hiss of hydraulics, the harness began to move, carrying Pegasus Prime toward the transport module. The process was agonizingly slow, each second precious as the countdown continued. 3:45. One of Cooper's men had managed to fire the tranquilizer at Tempest, but the dart had missed its mark. The Black Horse responded by intensifying the windstorm around the guards, forcing them to shield their eyes and struggle to keep their footing. Cooper, seeing the transfer in progress, abandoned all pretense of negotiation. He aimed his pistol directly at the transport controls and fired twice. Sparks flew as the bullets struck, but the system continued functioning. "Reinforced casing," Dr. Winters explained with a grim smile. "My design." 3:18. Thomas noticed movement from the stasis tank. Pegasus Prime's massive chest was now rising and falling with shallow breaths. Its wings twitched, golden feathers rustling. The transfer harness had moved it halfway to the transport module, but they were running out of time. "Cooper, you need to stop this," Thomas urged, trying one last appeal to reason. "If it fully awakens before the transfer is complete, none of us will be able to control it." "I'm not leaving without it," Cooper snarled, his composure completely gone. "Do you know how long I've been searching? How many resources I've expended? That creature will revolutionize warfare, transportation, medicine. The applications are endless." 2:41. Suddenly, government agents swarmed into the chamber from a second entrance none of them had noticed. A hidden elevator shaft on the far side of the room. Unlike Cooper's private security, these men wore official tactical gear with federal insignia. Leading them was the silver-haired woman Thomas had seen in his vision with Doc Williams. "Federal agents," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone freeze." The new development created a three-way standoff. Cooper and his men on one side, the government agents on another, and Thomas, Dr. Winters, and the four horses guarding the slowly awakening Pegasus Prime. 2:12. "Agent Keller," Dr. Winters said, acknowledging the woman. "I wondered when you'd join us." "Eleanor," Agent Keller replied with a curt nod. "We've been tracking your movements since Williams reported the sighting." Her gaze shifted to Pegasus Prime, then back to Dr. Winters. "You know we can't let you take it." "And you know I can't let you weaponize it," Dr. Winters countered. 1:47. Thomas noticed Monarch staring intently at Pegasus Prime, as if communicating with the awakening creature. The golden horse's eyes were now partially open, revealing irises of an impossible violet color that seemed to glow with inner light. Cooper, seeing an opportunity in the standoff between Dr. Winters and the federal agents, made a desperate move. He lunged toward the transport module, apparently intending to disconnect it and seize control of the process. What happened next occurred so quickly that Thomas would later struggle to recall the exact sequence of events. Monarch let out a piercing whinny that resonated throughout the chamber. The other 3 enhanced horses responded immediately, positioning themselves in a precise formation around the stasis equipment. 1-15. Pegasus Prime's eyes opened fully. It turned its head, taking in the scene, the humans with their weapons, the alarms, the other horses. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, suspended in a crystallized instant of perfect tension. Then Pegasus Prime unfurled its wings. Even partially confined by the transfer harness, the sight was breathtaking. 15 feet of golden feathers spread outward, catching the light and refracting it into dazzling patterns across the chamber walls. The creature let out a sound that was neither a whinny nor a neigh, but something altogether different, musical, almost ethereal. 042. "Everyone back away," Thomas commanded, surprising himself with his own authority. "Give it space." Cooper, ignoring the warning, reached for the transport controls. "It's mine," he hissed, his face twisted with obsession. In that moment, Pegasus Prime's gaze locked onto Cooper. There was intelligence in those violet eyes, but also something wild and ancient, something that recognized Cooper's intentions with perfect clarity. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, to charge with electricity. Pegasus Prime's wings began to glow, not reflecting light now, but generating it from within. The radiance built rapidly, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. 021. "Get down!" Dr. Winters shouted, pulling Thomas to the floor. A pulse of golden light erupted from Pegasus Prime, sweeping through the chamber like a silent explosion. When Thomas dared to look up, he saw Cooper frozen in place, his hand still outstretched toward the controls, but his eyes vacant, staring at something no one else could see. 0.0. The alarms fell silent. The countdown ended, and in the sudden quiet, Pegasus Prime lowered its wings and stepped calmly from the transfer harness into the transport module, which sealed automatically around it. The government agents stood immobile, their weapons lowered, expressions dazed. Cooper's men appeared similarly affected, as if waking from a deep sleep. Only Thomas, Dr. Winters, and the 4 enhanced horses seemed unaffected by whatever Pegasus Prime had done. "What just happened?" Thomas whispered. "Mental projection," Dr. Winters explained, her voice filled with wonder. "One of the abilities we theorized but never confirmed. It appears to have temporarily overwritten their immediate memories and intentions." Cooper blinked slowly, looking around in confusion. "What am I doing here?" he murmured. "Where is this place?" Agent Keller and her team showed similar disorientation, their coordinated effort now dissolving into uncertain murmurs and questioning glances. "The effect won't last long," Dr. Winters warned, already moving toward the transport module controls. "We need to move now." Thomas helped her secure the module for transport. Atlas positioned himself in the harness designed to pull it, while Monarch, Phoenix, and Tempest formed a protective formation around them. As they prepared to leave, Thomas approached Cooper, who was still struggling to orient himself. "Your debt is paid in full," Thomas said firmly. "You have no claim on my land, and you will leave my family alone. Understand?" Cooper nodded vaguely, his usual arrogance replaced by confusion and a hint of fear. Whatever Pegasus Prime had shown him had clearly left a profound impact. They departed through the hidden elevator shaft, emerging in a concealed equipment shed several hundred yards from the main cellar entrance. By the time they reached the edge of the property, dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold that reminded Thomas of Pegasus Prime's magnificent wings. "Will they remember?" Thomas asked as they made their way back toward the hills and the safe haven. "Not clearly," Dr. Winters replied. "They'll recall fragments, like pieces of a dream. Cooper may remember more given his obsession, but without context or clarity. "And my family. Waiting for you," she assured him. "Once Pegasus Prime is secure in the new facility, you can join them. Your farm will remain yours. I've taken steps to ensure the bank will reject any further offers from Cooper." Thomas glanced back at his farm, the simple house and fields that had been his world for so long. In just 3 days, everything had changed. He had changed. "What happens now?" he asked, turning to Monarch, who walked steadily beside him. Dr. Winters smiled. "That's up to you. Monarch chose you for a reason, Thomas. The bond you formed is rare, even among those who work with these extraordinary animals. We could use someone with your integrity and courage." Thomas considered this as they continued their journey. He thought of Sarah and the children, of the struggling farm, of the incredible secret that had been hidden beneath his fields for generations. He thought of Pegasus Prime and the responsibility his grandfather had accepted decades ago. Finally, he looked at Monarch, the remarkable horse who had entered his life disguised as a simple gift and ended up transforming everything. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that I'm ready for a different kind of farming." Monarch nickered softly, nudging Thomas's shoulder in what was unmistakably approval. The rising sun caught the horse's coat, making it gleam like burnished copper, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw something shimmer between the animal's shoulders, the merest suggestion of what might, someday, become wings. The end.